We're in John chapter 19. I'm going to begin reading in verse 38, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices and linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Chapter 20. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I've not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. There's a lot of focus in human history on traditions that have to do with our material remains. Even the covenant of Sinai in Numbers chapter 19 has a number of advices about what to do after someone has passed away. So it's not surprising that even in the gospel records, there's great concern over what should be done with Jesus' body and how to appropriately care for him now that he has passed away. That makes sense. But that focus on Jesus' body seems more than the usual. And we're going to talk about that focus on his body and what it really means for people of faith, I think. All of it culminates in Jesus' words to Mary in verse 17 when he says, "Don't hold on to me, don't hold on to my body, because I've not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God." There's a strangeness about the journey to follow Jesus, because it both begins and ends in death. It both begins and ends in death. We've already seen that in the Gospel of John, that to begin to follow Jesus, you and I have to go through some sort of a metaphorical, a spiritual death. We have to die to ourselves. All the Gospels are full of this. Anyone who wants to be my disciple must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Jesus says in another context, you have to hate mother and father, sister, children, wife for my sake, or you're not worthy of me. These are all ways of talking about a type of death, a dying to the things that generally inform who we are. So the Christian life begins with death. And what's interesting is that somehow the death of Jesus is the beginning for us. Now, it's the end of the gospel, but it's really the beginning of the Christian life. That's why we talked about the fact that Jesus died is the way most of us must begin our journey with him. But like Jesus' journey, it also ends in death as we await our resurrection. Somehow, I think that the journey of Jesus after his death, the body of Jesus, is meant to be a summary statement of the journey of faith itself. Jesus transforms the journey from birth to death into the journey to life everlasting. And as Jesus showed us bodily how to journey through this life in his earthly ministry, somehow his body continues to teach us after his death what it looks like to follow Jesus. As we consider the journey of Jesus' body from Calvary, from the cross, from Golgotha, where he was crucified, to the tomb, and then to the resurrection, we're going to consider the ways in which Jesus' disciples are forced to embody the life of discipleship simply in the way they handle Jesus' body. Jesus' suffering was completed on the cross, but all of his work was not completed there. There was still more to come. In fact, the most important thing that happens to Jesus is his resurrection from the dead, which happens after he dies on the cross. And so Jesus has to continue his journey, but there's a difficulty. He has died. How does he continue it? Well, it's picked up by his disciples after his death, and they have to continue the journey that his body began in life. And that's what we're going to look at today. I believe the journey of Jesus' body reveals the journey all who follow Jesus must take. It begins with death. Baptism is what we call it today. Jesus' death on the cross is the beginning of the life of discipleship for us. Now, after that, we look to John chapter 20, and we observe that the journey from death proceeds, this will be our first point, to the law and the prophets. It continues only by our chesed, by our love, by our loyalty to Jesus himself. And then finally, it culminates in our relinquishing of the flesh. Let's look first the way that Jesus' death progresses to the law and the prophets. Look at John chapter 19, verse 38. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, we remember that from John chapter 3, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices and linen cloths according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. When Jesus died, when he appeared to have left them, when the great promise that he was the Messiah who would deliver Israel looked to be ashes in their hands, when that happened, his disciples were left to decide whether or not to continue following him. And those who were faithful made sure that Jesus finished the journey he had started in life. Up till that point, being obedient to the law was within Jesus' control. But once he had died, there was nothing he could do to make sure his body continued to be submitted to the law of Moses. But Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus made sure that he did. Now, under Roman law, the bodies of executed criminals were usually left out to the elements to be preyed on by animals. It was meant to be a way to shame people who were killed for sedition. The Jewish people, though, were taught by Moses never to do that. They were not allowed to leave bodies out. The body could not be left out overnight. It had to be buried. And Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus knew that. And it's by their faithfulness that Jesus' body, now dead, continues to fulfill the law of Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22, when someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You shall bury him that same day, for anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for possession. Jesus could not ensure that he obeyed that command, but Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea made sure that he did. But even more than that, knowingly or unknowingly, by bringing such a large amount of myrrhs and aloes. This is the only gospel that tells us the amount of these things. 65 pounds, that's a lot. They would have needed servants to carry them. In doing that, Joseph and Nicodemus also fulfill a prophecy of Isaiah when they bury him in this way. Isaiah 53, verse 9. It's Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9. Says, they made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. By giving him this kind of a burial, they make him a wealthy person. This amount of spices was used only for the wealthy. History tells us that, for instance, the Rabbi Gamaliel, who's one of the highest respected rabbis of the first century, he was buried with 80 pounds of spice. Herod the Great had an entire train of people carrying spices and aloes with him while he was buried. So Professor D.A. Carson reminds us that the implication in the present narrative is that two wealthy men used their servants to carry the spices, help take Jesus' body down from the cross, and then prepare him for burial. This fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 53 about what would be done with the suffering servant's body. Again, Jesus doesn't have control over this. His disciples have to be obedient for him to finish his journey that he started while he was living. On any journey, there are 2 points that inevitably affect how we go. Of course, our destination is important, but where we start is important as well. And what I want to insist is that Jesus, throughout his earthly life, began with the law and the prophets. That's where he began. Everything he did was a fulfillment of those prophecies. And even after his death, those who wanted to help him continue his journey went back to the law of Moses, and they followed its stipulations to the letter. This is where following Jesus begins. After Jesus died, next came the law and the prophets for Joseph and Nicodemus. And after you and I die to ourselves, next comes the law and the prophets. There is no other place to start following Jesus than what is often called the Old Testament. I prefer to call it the First Testament. This is the beginning, and it's the beginning for everybody. And beginning there changes the destination. We might be aiming at loving our enemies and praying for those who persecute us. We might be aiming at not hating people. We might be aiming at being hospitable and generous. But how that looks will depend on where you start. And for the people of God, we start with the law and the prophets. There is no other place. And we see that that was an ethic carried not only by Jesus in his life, but by his disciples in his death. Consistently, the road to follow Jesus in the scriptures must pass through the law and the prophets. This is mandatory. There is no way to follow Jesus that circumvents the law and the prophets. There is none. But that journey that begins with our death and proceeds to the law and the prophets cannot continue, will not continue beyond the rituals of the law and legalism if we do not have chesed for Jesus himself, love, loyalty. That's our second point. Look at John chapter 20, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid them." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. What we see here is the loyalty of Jesus' disciples, the chesed of Jesus' followers to him. We see it in Mary, maybe most expressed in Mary, but also in Peter and John. They were in hiding because of fear of the Jews. That's what we're told throughout the Gospels. That's where they were. But when they hear that the tomb is empty, that has a lot of ramifications for the people of Israel, because what they did with that body was essential, not just now, but later. A year from now, or a year from his death, they were supposed to come back and collect his bones and put it in an ossuary, a burial box, and then put his body to rest in a place with his ancestors. So they had ongoing responsibilities. The location of Jesus' body was essential, and they were so loyal to him that even after he had died, they were concerned about his body. The gospel writer tells us, we read it together, that they didn't know he was going to rise yet. That might seem strange to say, since he had talked about it before he died. But they did not realize it. That's not why they ran to the tomb. They ran to the tomb out of concern for Jesus, out of concern for his body. Their loyalty to Jesus was much more than loyalty to the law. It was loyalty to him. It was chesed to Jesus. John has told us that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they had already prepared the body for burial. So why did Mary, and the Gospels tell us she didn't come alone, the other Gospels tell us she didn't come alone, why did they come? You might read Matthew, Mark, and Luke and think the body had not been prepared, and so they came to prepare it. But 3 days later, probably a little late to prepare this body. So why did they come? And we're told in John that it was already done. Well, it seems that Mary and the others could not stand to not be part of caring for Jesus' body. Everything happened so quickly that Friday, and Joseph and Nicodemus swooped in, as they should have, and they didn't get to participate And so it seems that they come back to the tomb to get to participate in the farewell to Jesus. This is a lot of love for Jesus, especially since none of them realize he's going to come back. They're still loyal. It seems to me that they were so faithful to Jesus that they couldn't stand to not see his body one more time. And some of you who've lost loved ones, you know this kind of loyalty. Our journey with Jesus begins with our deaths. This is our baptisms. This is when we deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus. When we separate ourselves from our family of origin, from our ethnic background, from whatever country we came from, and we start again a journey with Jesus that is free of these things. That's how it all begins. It proceeds then to the law and the prophets, where we get the first indications of what the road to righteousness looks like. But it never gets anywhere beyond that if we do not truly love Jesus. Our journey with Jesus does not continue past legalism and ritual and habit if we do not truly love him, if he is not the guiding principle of our lives. It was Jesus' love for the Father that saw him through, and it's only our love for Jesus that will see us through. Your journey with Jesus, and whether it succeeds or fails, whether it continues or we fall away, is about the depth of our chesed for him. Consistently, the road to follow Jesus in the Scriptures begins with our death. It proceeds to the law and the prophets. These are the beginnings. But we never get past that unless we have chesed for Jesus. It is in love of Jesus that we move beyond the law and the prophets. It's because of our chesed for Jesus that we move beyond the simple 10 commandments and we begin to not hate our brothers. We begin to not lust after those that we have no right to lust after. That we begin to pray for our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. That we begin to be hospitable with what we have. These are all ethics Jesus gives us that are far beyond the law. And we will never get there if we do not trust Jesus, if we do not truly love him. And many of our chesed for Jesus is tested when we are faced with these laws that Jesus gives us that are beyond the law, and we decide not to follow those laws. It's really our chesed for Jesus that is being exposed, not the weakness of our flesh. It was not Mary's faithfulness to the law of Moses that brought her back to that tomb. The law of Moses had been fulfilled by Joseph and by Nicodemus. It wasn't an understanding of the law of Moses that brought John and Peter to run when they found out the body had been missing. It was love for Jesus that brought them there and nothing else. The law can only take us so far. Love of Jesus has to take us the rest of the way. And as we have chesed for Jesus, Mary is going to discover that it's going to require more than just affection for Jesus or loyalty to him. But there's something else he's going to ask, and that's our third point. We're going to have to relinquish our hold on the flesh. That's our third point. Look at John chapter 20, verse 14. When Mary had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." That's chesed, that's loyalty. Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, she recognizes him then, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And then she apparently grabs hold of him. And Jesus said to her, "Don't hold on to me simply because I've not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary obeys and goes and does these things. When Mary met Jesus, she was still clinging to Jesus as she had known him in the flesh. She was still clinging to his body, the body that had been taken down from the cross and buried according to Jewish custom by Nicodemus and Joseph. The body that Mary and the others had come to embalm one last time. The missing body that she had wept over because she didn't know where he was and she needed to know where his remains were. That body she was still holding on to. And when she saw Jesus raised from the dead, she grabbed hold of his body again. This is all about his body, and she would not release it. And Jesus gives her a word. "Mary, don't hold on to me. Don't hold on to my body. simply because I've not yet ascended to the Father. Simply because you can. Simply because I'm here. All things may be permissible. Mary could grab hold of him, but it wasn't beneficial. She was grabbing onto the wrong thing. She had to let Jesus as she knew him go if she was to discover who he was to her now. She had met Jesus in the flesh, but now he was made of something else. And she would have to let the flesh of Jesus go. Our journey with Jesus begins with death. It proceeds to the law and the prophets. It only moves forward if we have chesed for Jesus. Otherwise, it stalls there. But it doesn't reach its intended goal until we can release the flesh, until we can let go of the things we think define who we are, until we can accept a future that is not tethered to the past. Throughout the New Testament, dying to the flesh is a dominant theme. Maybe there is no more dominant theme. One that's deeply rooted in the resurrection of Jesus. Paul does better than any other New Testament author that I can find of stitching together what it means to allow the resurrection of Jesus transform the loyalties of your life. This is Romans chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. What then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? You do not know that all of us, or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, we've been buried with him by baptism into death. You notice how Paul believes the journey from the cross to the grave is one we take with Jesus. That's the important thing. Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified with him, so that the body of sin might be destroyed and we might no longer be enslaved to sin. For whoever has died is freed from sin. But if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. The death he died to sin once for all. But the life he lives to God. So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. Therefore, do not let sin exercise dominion in your mortal bodies to make you obey their passions. No longer present your members to sin as instruments of wickedness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and present your members to God as instruments of righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. Releasing who we were is bound up in Jesus' resurrection, because it shows us, his resurrection from the dead shows us that our flesh is temporary, and that it is passing away, and that holding on to it is a waste of our time. This has consequences for our continued allegiance to sin, which is what Paul is talking about, but also for our continued allegiance to heritage and to race. All these things are of the flesh. Paul ties those two ideas together himself in Colossians chapter 3. Beginning in verse 5, we find these words. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly, fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. These are the ways you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Don't lie to one another, seeing that you've stripped off the old self with its practices and have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. In that renewal, there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free. But Christ is all and is in all. The flesh is passing away. Don't hold on to my body, Jesus says to Mary, because I am ascending to the Father. Jesus died a Jewish man. That was the man Mary had known. The disciples too. He died a Jewish man, but he was not raised a Jewish man. His body was now not materially derived from the earth. The Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that he now received a body that was made of spirit. To follow Jesus all the way, we must release the flesh in all the ways we think it defines who we are. If we cannot do this, we cannot follow Jesus all the way. And it seems to me that this is where many Christians fail. Like Mary, we cling to the flesh, not recognizing that the flesh has changed, that things are not the same, that where we're going now is more important than where we have been before. So long as we put the desires of the flesh first, we'll never receive what Jesus died to give us. We will never truly be new. We must recognize that the old order of things is passing away, and we will never find freedom in Christ if we cannot accept it. For all who wish to follow Jesus, we must hear with Mary Jesus' words. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me simply because I've not yet ascended to the Father, simply because I'm materially present to you, simply because you can. Don't hold on to me, Mary. The flesh is not what you hold on to. But here's the word I need you to bear, and I'm ascending to the Father, and you will ascend too. I'm going to prepare a place for you." We read that in John 14. So you need to let go of these things you're clinging on to, and you need to embrace that the times, they are changing. That a day is coming in which there will be no slave or free, Jew or Greek, when all will be the children of God, and their bodies will not be sourced in this world, so all the things that make us will be gone. Are you ready for that day? Are you living into it now? Or are you still sowing to the flesh? This is why we cannot break sin. Because we simply will not stop feeding the things that feed it. And that the flesh is what feeds it. It's not to say we can't enjoy life, but we have to enjoy it with an open hand. No grasping, no clinging, no holding. If God gives, then we enjoy. If God takes away, then we give him thanks. This life is fleeting. It's dust in our hands. Holding on to it will only keep us slaves to sin and to the world. And finally, at the end of our journey, hopefully at the midpoint, sometimes at the beginning, depends on how quickly these other steps are taken, Jesus will ask you to release the last vestiges of the things you think define you. The simple fact is, it is a moment in which Jesus asks you to release the things you didn't release when you first followed him. And there'll be more. That doesn't happen just one more time. It will happen over and over again. But each time is a critical moment. What defines you? Who are you? What would you fight for? What would you die for?